Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 1 of the second round playoff series between the San Jose Barracuda and the Colorado Eagles, in which the Barracuda have lost 6-3. The Barracuda are coming off of a first round 2-0 playoff series victory over the Ontario Reign a few days ago. Meanwhile, the Colorado Eagles actually have not played a game since the end of the AHL regular season. And the reason for this is that in the Calder Cup playoffs, at least for the Pacific Division, the top 7 teams actually qualify. And since that is not an even number, somebody has to sit out. And since Colorado was the number 1 seed, they were the ones who got to sit at home and watch, while the other 6 teams battled it out to see who made it to this second round, which means the Eagles have not played for a good couple of weeks at this point. So this was supposed to be a glance at how the type of relaxation and rest that the Eagles have managed to get would compare to maybe a team that's a little bit more warmed up and has a little bit more momentum because they already played in that first round. But it felt as though that was sort of nullified here because of the fact that the Barracuda, their series concluded on April 26th. This is now taking place 6 days later. That is a good amount of time off where it feels as though that momentum has maybe deflated just a little bit. And so this doesn't end up actually making that much of an impact early on in this game. What does, however, is the fact that this is the San Jose Barracuda's first home game of the playoffs. Technically, at least it's the first one that's taking place at their home arena, and it definitely had a lot more energy than either of those 2 games against the Ontario Reign, which were taking place at the Kings NHL arena. So this seemed to impart a lot more energy to this game. There was more physicality, not quite at the NHL level, but at least we're kind of getting there. And so the Barracuda did feel as though they were feeding off of that and were the better team in the first period, not by a huge margin, but at least by a little bit. They had some good chances, but unfortunately, it was the Eagles who ended up striking first, making it 1-0 by the end of this first period. In the second period, the Barracuda run into a little bit of penalty trouble, which has been a big thing for them for pretty much the entirety of this season, one of the more penalized teams in the entire AHL this season, and so it ends up turning a 1-0 game into a 3-0 game. Luckily for the Barracuda, they do get one back. That one comes from Philip Biestet shorthanded. He makes it 3-1, but before the second period can conclude, Ludwig gets the 3-goal lead back for Colorado. It is 4-1 after 40 minutes. And at the beginning of the third period, it does seem as though the Eagles are pretty much just going to shut things down. They had a really strong neutral zone setup that was really choking out the Barracuda, who could just not seemingly complete more than a couple of passes together. Relatively sloppy play from them, and the Eagles also doing a good part defensively. But sometimes it just takes a single shot, a single bounce to really get your energy back up and get you back into the game. And that's indeed what happens on this Colin Graf goal. He spins and fires this from the boards towards the net, and it takes a lucky bounce through the Eagles goaltender, and that brings the Barracuda to within 2. And a few minutes later, with the goaltender pulled, Colin White puts it into a 1-goal game. The Barracuda actually come extremely close after that to tying this one up. Philip Biestet has the opportunity, but it's a swing and a miss. And then just a few seconds later, Megna buries it into the empty net to make it 5-3, and eventually another empty netter is added, and it is a 6-3 final score here in Game 1. So the Barracuda down 1-0, and in a best-of-5 series, not a best-of-7 just yet here, in a best-of-5, even just one loss is a pretty big deal. When it comes to what kind of the strategy maybe that the Barracuda will really want to implement here to try and beat the Eagles in this series, the big thing will be trying to not fall behind, and that might seem as though it's stating the obvious here, but especially against Colorado, we saw, as I said, in the early parts of this third period, how they were setting up in the neutral zone. They really weren't pushing for much offense, but they were forechecking hard. That 1-1-3 type of setup was not really allowing the Barracuda to do much, and the reason they can do this is because they had a 3-goal lead. They didn't have to generate anything. But if the Barracuda instead can either have a tie game or especially a 1-goal, a 2-goal lead, that will force the Eagles to have to play a little bit more aggressively. And what we saw in the earlier parts of this game, first period, second period, is that can lead to some mistakes from Colorado. There were multiple moments in which Barracuda players were able to pressure the points, get the puck away, and create rush chances going back in the other direction. That's definitely going to be something the Barracuda will want to do. If they're falling behind a couple of goals here, it seems as though Colorado is good enough to really just shut things down, unless, I guess, and they get really unlucky with a Colin Graf type of unlucky bounce goal. When it comes to the players to talk about, this will be a little bit different from what I usually do for NHL game reviews where I discuss every single player. Instead, I was sort of focusing more so on the younger guys here, players who will make more so of an impact with the San Jose Sharks within the next year or the next couple of years. Other guys, like a Van Roboys here, not really keeping as close of an eye on him. If there was maybe a really standout type of player, I'll mention them. For instance, I thought Scott Sabourin made a huge impact on this game just with his physicality and also a surprising amount of offensive skill showcased on top of that, but mostly we'll be talking about those younger guys. First, on the top line, we have Danil Gushchin. Now, Gushchin, I think what we really saw here tonight is that he is one of the most skilled players on the ice across both teams, really. There were a lot of moments where he was showcasing that type of talent, but what kind of left me wanting more in this game from Gushchin is that it felt as though there was a lack of kind of aggressiveness and a lack of killer instinct coming from Danil Gushchin. There were moments where we did see this, for instance, when he would make like a mistake. This happened a couple of times. He would do a very hard work trying to correct that mistake, on like the back check or something like that. Or when he would take a hit, he would go back and he'd dish it right back out. But besides those moments, when he was not forced to do so, it felt more so that Gushchin was kind of going through the motions a little bit, which I did not quite appreciate. The thing is especially in the playoffs, when you step out onto the ice for your shift, you want to try and make an impact. And that is not necessarily in terms of generating a scoring chance or even just getting a shot on net. Sometimes just the really simple plays of a good stick check, a good clear out of the zone, a good hit, a good block, something along those lines that when you come back to the bench, your coach gives you a tap on the back because you did a good job. That's what you really want to be able to do. That is what it is a game of inches in the playoffs, and that's really what gives you the advantage. And for Gushchin, there were moments where he had that offensive flair, but there weren't enough moments where it felt as though he was doing those little things that really helped contribute to an overall victory for the team. So hopefully he can get a little bit closer to that. Again, as I said, when he was kind of forced into these situations, when he's getting a hit, when he's making a mistake, he is really willing to raise that level. I want to see that raised level from the start through the 60 minutes. When it comes to his line mate, we then have Colin Graf. This is once again probably the case of me overestimating Graf, and perhaps there will reach a point in these playoffs where I just stop having such high expectations. But for someone who played almost half of the year with the San Jose Sharks in the NHL, I was, again, just expecting a little bit more. I thought Colin Graf was pretty good here, but I'm not just expecting pretty good. I'm expecting very good. I'm expecting great play from Graf, and yeah, he scores a goal, and it's an important one that gets the Barracuda back in, but it's not as though this is exactly how he drew this one up. It's just a fortunate bounce here. And so there were some decent defensive reads. There was a nice block. There was a good play up at the blue line that created a 2-on-0 pretty much between him and Gushchin that unfortunately the Barracuda weren't able to score on. These are all like solid plays, but again, it's just about wanting to see that extra bit from him that didn't quite happen here tonight. When it comes to the Barracuda's second line, next I'll talk about Philip Bystedt. Bystedt as well, kind of like with Gushchin, I thought showcased a good amount of skill here. There was some talent that you could really see that this is kind of that player with some first round pedigree, moments where he's possessing the puck very well. There was in the last few minutes of the third period, he deked around multiple different Colorado Eagles players before just barely losing the puck before getting a shot off. His goal here, actually shorthanded, was both impressive, not just with the shot that he took, which was the first goal that actually beat Miner, who was looking really, really good up to that point between the pipes for the Colorado Eagles, but also just the play that sets up this breakaway for himself where he's able to poke this puck out very nicely around the Eagles defenseman up at the blue line to create that breakaway. There were a lot of good moments for Bystedt here tonight. The big thing I think that I've noticed about Philip Bystedt is that he does need to play with a little bit more pace. There were a couple of moments here tonight where he's hanging onto the puck just a bit too long, where he's trying to search for the perfect play instead of just maybe making a simple one that either maintains possession or keeps the puck down low. And if he's sort of getting punished for these types of plays in the AHL, he's going to get murdered for them in the NHL. So he needs to kind of speed up a little bit in that way offensively, and also defensively, he also needs to try and kind of be a little bit less reactive. Right now, it feels as though he's following the puck, he's watching the puck. It's not the worst defensive play, but it can be better, especially for a player who's gunning for a bottom six slot in the future. You need to be strong and defensively responsible in that particular area. And so you want to really try and be one step ahead of the play so that you can put yourself in the correct position where even if the opponents don't make a pass to the guy you're covering, it's because you're in the strong spot instead of having to react with like a diving stick play to try and interrupt a shot or a pass or anything like that. Bistad, I think there's more progress to be made here, but there is clearly a good amount of talent there. The other player on this line I want to mention is Ethan Cardwell, who I think brought a lot of energy here tonight. It seemed as though he was ready to go right from the beginning, trying to be physical. It did feel, on the other hand, however, that he occasionally crossed the line. Maybe he was a bit too overexcited, too much energy here. We saw actually on one of these Eagles power play goals that he has the puck for a shorthanded chance. Instead of just shooting this on net, trying to get the face off in the offensive zone, he tries to make the pass. It's extremely off the mark, and a few seconds later it ends up in the back of their own net. This is a moment in which Cardwell is trying to just make as much of an impact as possible, really help his team win, and it ends up backfiring. So maybe lower the energy levels a little, try to kind of keep that same type of energy, but not overforce in these situations. When it comes to the Barracuda's third line, the main player I want to talk about here is actually Ostapchuk. This was a player who played a handful of games in the NHL with the San Jose Sharks, much more with the Ottawa Senators this year in the NHL, and I had given them a grade of a C in the fourth quarter because I didn't really feel as though he was making much of an impact, but he wasn't a huge liability either, which is mostly fine for a fourth liner, but I thought coming down to the AHL, playing with the Barracuda, since he had put up a good amount of points with the Ottawa Senators AHL affiliate team, that he would end up being more of an offensive impact player for the Barracuda. And I'm not saying that he did absolutely nothing here tonight. He was okay, and he did have one really good chance early in the first period, swing and a miss for him in those first few minutes that could have put the Barracuda up 1-0. But besides that, offensively, I don't think he made a huge impact on this game. And what was maybe a little bit more worrying, like I said with Filip Bistad, is that Ostapchuk, as someone who's really more so looking for that bottom six type of role into the future for himself, perhaps as soon as next year, if the Sharks are going to use him in that role, he needs to be more responsible defensively. And on this first goal, or not this first goal, but there was a great chance a couple of minutes before this first goal that Askarov came up with a huge save on. It is entirely off the back of Ostapchuk completely puck watching and not noticing the player that is coming in behind him all alone for that great opportunity. This is just simply an unacceptable play here in this situation. It simply cannot happen, and yet it did on Ostapchuk's watch. So not a very impressive look in that particular area, and when that's sort of like your one big noticeable play outside of the swing and a miss chance earlier on, it doesn't stand out very well. On the other player on this line, Patrick Giles, not quite a prospect, I would say, 25 years old at this point, not really someone who you expect to be like a big name player. However, I will say there is a non-zero chance that Giles could play with the Sharks in the NHL next season. I thought in his short stint this year with the Sharks, he actually looked all right, and he's had a decent start to these AHL playoffs as well, especially this game where I thought he made a pretty big impact. So obviously, it depends on the moves that Mike Grier makes. If he brings in a bunch of different names, Giles is obviously going to get pushed out. But if there's only a couple players brought in, and many of it targeting the blue line, maybe there's an opportunity here for this player to step into a role. On the defensive side of things, just a couple of players that I want to talk about. The first, of course, being Luca Cagnoni. The big good news here for Cagnoni is that I thought he played with a ton of confidence. This is a player who stepped out and he knows that he wants to be the number one guy. He wants to be the offensive driver on this team, and I think he did a pretty good job of that. There were moments in the defensive zone, instead of just making the simple play of just chipping it out of the zone or working it off the boards, he would carry it out himself to maintain possession, to try and set up a good chance. And I thought that was very important for someone who wants to be that offensive guy. On the other hand, however, I think as one major thing to work on for Cagnoni would be his kind of his pivots on his skates, his first kind of one or two maneuverability type of steps in both the offensive zone and the defensive zone. I think a good comparison for Cagnoni is rookie Lane Hutson with the Montreal Canadiens, a top rookie in the league this year who actually played in the playoffs as well against the Washington Capitals just recently. You watch Lane Hutson, he's got that top speed, he's a very, very fast player, but it's those first couple couple of steps that really allow him to evade defenders and forecheckers in both the offensive and the defensive zone. At the blue line, completely deking around guys to eliminate them from the play and set up a good shooting lane or a passing lane. And then in the defensive zone, as a 5'9" defenseman, similar to Luca Cagnoni, if you're not able to avoid body checks on a pretty consistent basis, you're going to just get absolutely destroyed. And so just being able to take that quick step, something that we also see someone like Macklin Celebrini do on a pretty consistent basis, is extremely, extremely important. And I won't say Cagnoni was terrible at this throughout this game, but there were definitely some plays, some shifts in which he was rubbed out along the boards, eliminated in those spots, and ended up not making a huge impact just in that one particular area. And so that is going to be something, not necessarily through the rest of these playoffs to improve, but going into the off season, being able to be a little bit quicker on his skates is like that first step, that more agility style, I think will be very, very important for Luca Cagnoni to take that next step here in his game. And then when it comes to Jack Thompson, this was a player who I didn't think had a major impact on this game. Offensively, I thought he was decent. Defensively, I thought once more he was just decent. And so this could either be viewed as a good thing or a bad thing. If you are someone who wanted to see Jack Thompson be like a top 6 guy next year, maybe a top 7 guy next year with the San Jose Sharks, well, just being decent here in the AHL isn't great. But if you're someone who maybe more so projects him as being like a top defenseman with the Barracuda next year as well, then this is not too bad. Really, the first step as a defenseman that you really want to be able to accomplish is just simply not being a liability. If you can go through a game and nobody really notices you, you're likely doing a pretty good job. And then if you truly want to be a difference maker, that's where you actually have to be noticeable in a good way. I think Thompson got that first step down. It's about taking the second step. And then when it comes to goaltender Yaroslav Askarov, I mentioned how he was the Barracuda's MVP in the first round against the Ontario Reign. He led in 1 goal across both of those games. Extremely, extremely impressive. And I had also mentioned that if the Barracuda actually wanted to be competitive against this first seed Colorado Eagle team, especially as Podorowski and Bordelot and Mukhamadullin all remain on the sidelines with injury, the Askarov again would need to be that MVP. And here tonight, I don't think Askarov was terrible, but he simply was just not quite that self that he needs to be for the Barracuda to actually pull off a win. If you go through these goals, the Rosen one is off of a really bad change from the Barracuda. He's alone in the slot. Can't blame Askarov too much. The Wagner goal, this one is tipped in. Then the goal here from Megna is one in which Askarov gets knocked down, I think, by his own player, Hache, especially since the Barracuda did not end up challenging this goal. Really only the fourth one from Ludwig is one that it goes through traffic, but I think Askarov could have made the save on. But the point is that against Ontario, he was making some of those big saves that you might not have expected a goaltender to do, like those above average type of difference maker saves, and he didn't quite do that here tonight against the Eagles, and it ends up being a 1-goal loss for the Barracuda at the end of the day. And so he does need to be a little bit better for the Barracuda to come back in this series. But that will do it for this review. They will be back in action in just a couple of days on Sunday, the final home game of this series. They definitely want to try and tie this one up before going back to Colorado. They don't want to be going down there down 2-0 in this series. We'll see what happens. The way this game ended does give some hope heading into the next one. Class dismissed.